For most of the last 50 years, global money moved through a small set of Western-controlled systems. SWIFT carried the messages between banks, the dollar settled the trades. Visa and MasterCard handled the card swipes. That setup felt as permanent as gravity. China spent the last decade steadily building an entirely separate version of all three, layer by layer, and most of the world barely noticed until the numbers got impossible to ignore. Inside China alone, mobile payments crossed $80 trillion in a single year. Two apps, Alipay and WeChat Pay, handle roughly 96% of that volume between them, with a combined user base larger than the population of Europe and North America put together. Layered on top of that is a card network moving more transactions worldwide than Visa. Layered underneath it is a cross-border settlement system built specifically to move money without ever touching a Western bank. This isn't one clever app or one government pilot program. It's four separate financial systems, built over the same decade, now working together as one connected structure: a card network, a super app duopoly, a facial recognition payment layer, and a cross-border settlement rail running underneath all of it. For decades, the assumption was that no country could realistically build a parallel financial system from scratch, at scale, fast enough to matter. That assumption is being tested right now, and the test is further along than most people outside China realize. Most Western coverage of this story picks one piece and runs with it. A headline about the digital yuan here, a story about UnionPay's growth there, treated as isolated developments. Almost nobody connects all four pieces into the same picture, which is exactly why the full scale of what's been built has stayed under the radar for so long. That's the gap this story is about to close. Let's be precise about where each individual piece of this actually stands, because the real picture is more interesting than a simple takeover story. If you're into watching entire industries get rebuilt from the ground up while nobody's looking, hit that like button and subscribe. Because the honest version of this story isn't one company beating Visa. It's an entire country building four interlocking systems at once, at a pace no single Western institution has ever had to match. Start with the cross-border piece. China's settlement system, called CIPS, processed roughly $24 trillion in 2024, growing 43% in a single year. That sounds enormous until you compare it to the dollar's actual position today. The yuan still accounts for barely 3% of global payments tracked by SWIFT, against 51% for the dollar. CIPS is growing fast. It is not close to replacing the system it's often described as attacking. The consumer side tells a different story. Alipay has passed 1 billion users. WeChat Pay's parent app counts 1.4 billion monthly users. Together, they've made China one of the most cashless societies on Earth, with facial recognition payment terminals now installed at 500,000 locations nationwide. China's own card network, UnionPay, now moves more total transaction volume than Visa worldwide. Here's the catch worth understanding before we go further. Almost all of that consumer dominance sits inside China's own borders. Strip out Chinese spending, and UnionPay's global market share collapses to roughly 1%. Alipay and WeChat Pay are only beginning to build real acceptance overseas. The domestic fortress is real and enormous. The international expansion is still its opening chapter. That gap between domestic scale and international reach is exactly where the real story sits. It's easy to dismiss a system that's still small outside its home market. It's much harder to dismiss one that's already proven it can win completely at home, in the largest consumer market on Earth, before it's even finished its first serious attempt abroad. That distinction matters more than it sounds. A financial system that dominates one massive domestic market can look unstoppable in the headlines while barely registering anywhere else. The real question isn't whether China built something impressive at home. It clearly did. The real question is how fast that domestic fortress turns into genuine international reach, and that answer is still being written one country at a time. So how did one country end up building a card network, two payment super apps, a facial recognition payment layer, and a cross-border settlement system, all inside the same 10-year window? That story starts with a much smaller, much less glamorous piece of financial plumbing most people have never heard of. The foundation piece came first, and it wasn't flashy. In 2015, the People's Bank of China launched CIPS, a system built to clear and settle payments made in yuan between banks around the world. At launch, it had just 19 direct participants. Nobody outside central banking circles paid it much attention. That quiet start is worth remembering because almost every major financial system in history began the exact same way: small, boring, and easy to dismiss. Nobody watching CIPS process its first handful of transactions in 2015 would have guessed it would be handling tens of trillions of dollars a decade later. While CIPS grew slowly in the background, the real transformation was happening on ordinary phones. Alipay, launched years earlier as a simple payment tool for online shopping, evolved into a full financial app, handling everything from bill payments to investing. WeChat Pay rode along inside the country's biggest messaging app, turning a chat platform into a payment network almost by accident. By the early 2020s, the two apps had become so dominant that carrying cash in a major Chinese city started to feel unusual rather than normal. UnionPay took a different path. Founded in 2002 as China's domestic card network, it spent 2 decades building overwhelming scale inside China's own borders before making a serious push overseas. That order mattered. A card network needs merchants willing to accept it, and Chinese merchants had every reason to accept a network already used by over 1 billion domestic customers. International expansion could wait until the domestic base was unshakable. By the middle of this decade, all 3 systems had reached genuine scale on their own terms. CIPS was processing trillions of dollars a year. Alipay and WeChat Pay had become the default way most of China's population paid for anything. UnionPay had steadily become the highest volume card network on Earth, even if most of that volume never left China. None of this happened through one master plan executed on schedule. It happened through 4 separate systems, built by different institutions for different reasons, that ended up reinforcing each other anyway. A settlement system that moves money between banks, a pair of apps that move money between people, a card network that moves money between merchants. Put together, they form something no single Western company was ever built to compete with, because no single Western company was ever asked to build all 4 pieces at once. That timing wasn't coordinated by a single central planner sitting in one office either. Each system answered to its own institutional pressures, its own market, its own set of problems to solve. What made the difference was a government willing to fund and protect all 4 efforts simultaneously for a full decade without demanding any of them show an immediate profit. That last point deserves a second look. Visa was built to move money between merchants and banks. It was never asked to also build a messaging network or a super app or a nationwide facial recognition system. Neither was MasterCard. Neither was SWIFT. Each Western system solved exactly one problem, well, and stopped there, because there was never a single institution positioned to coordinate all 4 pieces at once the way one government-linked system was in China. Start with the piece doing the least visible, most technical work, actually moving money between banks in different countries. Most people confuse SWIFT with the system that moves money. It doesn't. SWIFT is a messaging network. It tells one bank what another bank wants done, similar to sending a very secure, very standardized instruction letter. The actual movement of funds still depends on banks holding accounts with each other, or with a clearing system that settles the difference. CIPS is that clearing system, built specifically and deliberately for the yuan. It operates as a real-time gross settlement system, meaning payments clear individually and immediately rather than getting bundled and netted out later. Banks connect either directly, holding an account with CIPS itself, or indirectly, routing transactions through a bank that does. As of recent counts, CIPS links more than 1,700 participants across well over 100 countries and regions. Here's the detail that gets missed in most coverage of this system. CIPS still relies on SWIFT's messaging network for a large share of its own transactions, since SWIFT remains the standard almost every bank on Earth already knows how to use. In March of 2025, SWIFT and CIPS signed an agreement to work together rather than compete, with SWIFT even helping CIPS adopt the newest international messaging standard. This isn't a hostile takeover of the old system, it's a new settlement rail, built underneath the existing messaging layer, ready to carry more weight as demand for yuan settlement grows. That distinction matters for anyone trying to picture how this plays out. CIPS doesn't need SWIFT to disappear to succeed, it just needs more banks choosing yuan settlement as a real option, one transaction at a time, while still using the same messaging system they already trust to send the instructions. That partnership matters more than a rivalry would. A hostile competitor trying to replace SWIFT outright would face years of resistance from banks unwilling to abandon a system they already trust. a settlement rail that plugs into SWIFT's existing messaging instead of fighting it, can grow without asking thousands of banks to rip out systems they already rely on every single day. Where CIPS handles money moving between banks, Alipay and WeChat Pay handle money moving between actual people billions of times a day, mostly by scanning a simple black and white square. The QR code payment model turned out to be the right technology at the right moment. It required no special hardware beyond a smartphone camera, making it cheap enough for even a small street vendor to accept digital payment instantly. That low barrier to entry is a huge part of why China leapfrogged credit cards almost entirely, moving straight from cash to mobile payments without most of the population ever owning a plastic card. The next layer beyond QR codes is biometric authentication, and it's already running at real scale. Alipay's Smile to Pay facial recognition system operates at roughly 500,000 locations across China, letting a shopper pay by looking at a camera instead of pulling out a phone at all. Palm vein recognition, which reads the unique pattern of veins beneath a person's skin, is emerging as the next step past facial recognition, offering another layer of biometric identity that doesn't require touching a shared surface or showing your face to a camera. Each of those steps removes one more piece of friction between a person and a completed transaction. Cash required carrying paper, cards required carrying plastic, and remembering a PIN. A phone still requires taking it out and unlocking it. A face or a palm requires nothing extra at all, which is exactly why these systems keep pushing toward removing the device entirely from the transaction. That progression matters beyond simple convenience. Every step removed also removes a moment where a transaction could fail. A card could get declined. A phone could run out of battery. A wallet could get left at home. A payment system with fewer failure points processes more transactions successfully, faster, at a scale that starts to matter enormously once you're running it across a country of over 1 billion people making purchases every single day. The last piece of this system is the one built to look and feel most familiar to anyone outside China: a plastic card network competing directly with Visa and MasterCard. By total transaction volume, UnionPay now moves more money worldwide than either Visa or MasterCard individually, a seriously remarkable achievement for a network barely 2 decades old. But that headline number needs immediate context. The overwhelming majority of that volume comes from inside China itself, where UnionPay enjoys built-in advantages no foreign network can easily match, including years of preferential treatment in domestic banking and merchant systems. Outside China, the picture flips entirely. UnionPay's global market share, once China's own transactions are excluded, sits at roughly 1%, a small fraction of what Visa and MasterCard still command across the rest of the world. That gap is exactly where UnionPay's real growth story is happening now. New card issuance outside China has been climbing, with roughly 1/3 of all new UnionPay cards in recent years going to customers outside the country, driven by growing acceptance among merchants serving Chinese tourists, students, and business travelers. That 1% figure sounds small until you remember where it started. A decade ago, UnionPay's presence outside China was close to non-existent, limited mostly to a handful of border towns and airport kiosks catering to Chinese travelers. Getting to even 1% of a market as massive and entrenched as global card payments, against 2 networks with a combined head start measured in generations, is itself a meaningful climb. That expansion strategy mirrors what CIPS and the payment apps are also doing, just through a different channel. Win completely at home first. Use that overwhelming domestic base to fund and justify a slower, more patient push into markets where Visa and MasterCard still hold the advantage. Look at CIPS alone, and it's an interesting but modest challenger to the dollar system today. Look at UnionPay alone, and it's a card network still tiny outside its home market. Look at Alipay and WeChat Pay alone, and they're domestic super apps with real but early ambitions abroad. Judged one at a time, none of these systems looks like it's about to reshape global finance. That's exactly the wrong way to look at it. The actual story isn't any single system. It's that China built all 4 layers of a modern financial stack: settlement, cards, consumer payments, and biometric authentication inside the same rough decade, largely in parallel. In the West, those 4 layers evolved separately, built by different companies in different countries over the better part of a century. SWIFT and the correspondent banking system took shape across the mid to late 20th century. Visa and MasterCard grew out of separate bank card programs starting in the 1950s and 60s. Consumer payment apps arrived decades later still, bolted onto systems that already existed. Nobody ever had to build all four pieces from scratch, at the same time, designed from day one to work together. China did exactly that, largely because it had the chance to skip straight past decades of legacy systems most Western institutions are still stuck running on. There was no entrenched card network to work around, no established messaging standard everyone already trusted, no existing consumer payment habit built around cash and checks. Building fresh, without that legacy weight, let each new system get designed to plug directly into the others from the very beginning. That's the invisible engine underneath every individual number in this story. Not one dominant app or one impressive settlement system, but four pieces engineered to reinforce each other, all advancing on roughly the same timeline, all backed by the same government with every incentive to make sure they actually connect. Picture what that coordination actually looks like in practice. A tourist paying with Alipay inside China eventually sends money through banks connected to CIPS. A merchant accepting UnionPay taps into the same underlying banking relationships that also support the settlement system. None of these connections needed a special committee to arrange them. They exist because the institutions building all four systems were never operating in true isolation from each other in the first place. That's a structural advantage that's seriously hard to replicate after the fact. A Western institution trying to catch up today would need to somehow retrofit that same coordination onto systems that already grew up separately, answering to different regulators, different shareholders, and different competing priorities. Building four connected systems from a blank page is one kind of hard problem. Reconnecting four systems that already exist independently, each with decades of institutional habits baked in, is a different and arguably harder one. Two American institutions have the most to think carefully about here, and they're not worried about the same threat at all. The dollar-based system, SWIFT, and the correspondent banking network built around it still dominates completely. 51% of global payments tracked by SWIFT move in dollars. The yuan sits at roughly 3%. CIPS is growing fast, but it's growing from a small base against an incumbent that isn't standing still either. Nobody serious should expect the dollar's position to meaningfully change within the next several years. Visa and MasterCard face a narrower but sharper problem. UnionPay isn't beating them globally today, not with its international market share still stuck around 1%. But it's already the highest volume card network on Earth by total transactions, proof that a serious global-scale challenger can exist. The real risk isn't next year's earnings call. It's every year going forward, as UnionPay's international card issuance keeps climbing off a base that barely existed a decade ago. That kind of slow, compounding growth is exactly the pattern Visa and MasterCard should worry about most. A dramatic overnight loss of market share would be easy to spot and easy to respond to. A steady 1 or 2 percentage points of international share shifting away every year, spread thin across dozens of countries, is much harder to notice until a decade has already passed and the numbers have moved further than anyone expected. What should actually worry Western financial institutions isn't any single number in this story. It's the coordination. A settlement system, a card network, and two consumer super apps, all built by different institutions but all ultimately answering to the same government, all improving on roughly the same timeline. Western competitors don't get that kind of alignment. Visa doesn't coordinate with SWIFT's roadmap. SWIFT doesn't coordinate with any bank's app strategy. Each Western system solves its own problem, on its own schedule, answering to its own shareholders. China built four systems that don't have to ask each other's permission to work together, because in the end, they were never really separate systems to begin with, no matter how different they look from the outside. None of that means the outcome here is already settled. It means the opening moves are already finished, and most of the world is only now starting to notice the board. When one country builds every layer of a financial system at once, how many separate companies does it actually take on the other side to even begin answering that kind of coordination?